more information about the local plan review, which Ruth is going to start with in a moment. Then we're going to go on to Tom talking about energy efficiency improvements to traditional buildings. We were then going to have Dean giving a general planning update, but unfortunately, Dean has a number of his family members who've gone down with COVID. So Dean isn't able to join us this morning, but Claire is going to be taking us through some of those general planning updates, particularly on scale and the Environment Act. And then we will have an opportunity for further questions and answers, although clearly as we go through each presentation, it would make sense if there's something directly relevant to that particular presentation that we take questions at the end of it. So I'll do it that way, if that's okay with everybody. We'll have the presentation and then we'll have questions on that item. So if I could ask you please to make sure that you are muted. Oh, morning, Margaret. Well done for getting here. If you can make sure that you're muted, we'll go straight into the first presentation, which is from Ruth on the local plan review. Over to you, Ruth.
Morning, everybody. As Stephen says, I'm just going to do a reasonably quick, but hopefully helpful, run through the local plan 5-year review that we are doing here at the National Park Authority, and explaining really a bit of context, because you will have been sent as parishes a survey earlier this month, and we hope that this will be helpful in just providing some background to it. The presentation I'm going to do is very similar to the one I did for the workshop in December, so I'm going to apologise in advance for any of you that were there, because it will be similar, but hopefully will nevertheless be helpful. We are looking to hear your views through the survey that has been sent to clerks for the most part. And so the survey runs until the end of February, which I hope gives enough time for you to consider. And then hopefully, as I say, this presentation this morning will just be useful background while you are thinking about responses. I'm going to try and share my screen now, so I hope that goes okay. Should be coming up in a moment. Now, I'm hoping that you can all see that screen now. And if I don't hear otherwise, I will go in. Good, lovely.
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. You can skip past that first slide. The presentation is divided into 4 broad sort of parts. First of all, an explanation of what the purpose of the review is. And then a summary of the work that we've done to date, because we started work on this at the end of 2020, early 2021. Then a summary of the interim key findings. So those are the findings to date. We're not finished with the review, hence the importance of the survey. And we want to just describe what we have mainly found from our work to date. And that is the starting point for the survey that's been sent to you, because we want to hear your views on our interim findings. And then lastly, what happens next. So if we move on to the purpose of the review, as most of you will know, hopefully all of you will know, local plans are the document which holds the planning framework for an area. All planning authorities are required to produce one, because the planning policies are the starting point for planning decisions. Planning decisions need to be in line with planning policies, unless there are good planning reasons which override them. So they're important documents. And our adopted local plan is for Exmoor, so it reflects Exmoor's special circumstances and the fact that we are a designated national park. And I think it's worth adding to that, and a very, very rural area. So, you know, the policies we have are trying to find the best approach really for us, because we're unique. And then the local planning authorities are required, once they've got an adopted local plan, to carry out a review of that plan at least once every 5 years. And the purpose of a review is to assess whether the local plan needs updating. So it's a bit confusing. It's not the same as the longer full local plan review that can follow that, where you actually review the plan starting at the beginning. This is a process, and it's confusing because they're both called reviews, but this is the process to assess whether the plan needs updating. So it's an earlier process. Because the Exmoor plan was adopted in July 2017, the review has to be completed by July this year. So the purpose of the review is to take account of changing circumstances. So it's what has changed since the plan was adopted in 2017. And there isn't a great deal of detail set out on how these reviews need to be carried out. There is good guidance out there which we're following, but the key things that are mentioned are whether there have been changes to circumstances, changes to national planning policy, so that's mainly in the national planning policy framework, significant changes to the local housing need figure, because in many areas, particularly outside national parks, you're looking at quite high numbers of housing that needs to be delivered. And so if there's been a real change to that figure, that would usually trigger a local plan review. The National Park Authority is therefore carrying out a review of the local plan to establish whether the evidence suggests a partial or complete review of the plan is needed. So it's an evidence-based review, looking at all the information, including that I've set out earlier. But it's just worth emphasising that doesn't automatically mean that a full or partial review of the local plan is needed. And officers will need to come to a view based on evidence as to whether they think a partial, a complete, or no review of the local plan is needed at this time. And it's obviously at a point in time. I suppose the key questions really are, is the plan working, and are any changes needed to it? So the next part of the presentation is just a summary of what we've worked on to date, to give you information on that. It's worth just saying, actually, as alongside the survey that's been sent to parishes is a link to the webpage with the information that we have prepared so far on this review, so the interim topic papers, which set out the evidence that's been looked at. And there's also a summary paper with a shorter sort of explanation of what the key findings have been in the process. So the first thing that we did is we had discussions with the authority's development management team to consider their comments on how planning policies are being implemented when planning applications are being decided or recommendations are being made to the planning committee. We've also had further discussions to consider changes such as permitted development rights and changes to the use class order, which is the basis for changes of use, brought in since the local plan was adopted, so in the last 4.5–5 years. And from those discussions, there have been no significant issues raised at this stage. We've also completed assessment against national policy, which I was just explaining about earlier in the NPPF. That's important because national policy sets the agenda, for planning that happens at a more local level. And we haven't identified significant areas where the local plan is not compliant. We do think there's further work needed, but this, we think, as officers, relates mainly to implementation of policies, not necessarily needing policy changes, and I'll come on to this in a bit more detail later. We produce something called the Authority Monitoring Report, which sets out on an annual basis the changes and indicators for development, including through the local plan, and then other information and data as well, such as house prices. And we've gone through the data that runs up to the most recent period, which is up to March 2021. And that document will be available fairly soon, but at the moment there's nothing major coming out of that assessment, except I think the thing that we've mainly noted is issues around affordable housing delivery. And I'll come on to this in a bit more detail later on. We have produced updated evidence on local affordable housing need. That was something that I mentioned was one of the things the government highlights as being important. So we had a specific study carried out using the most recent data. And the headline from that really is that the overall projected affordable housing need in the national park is similar, slightly lower than the adopted plan, which has a figure in it of local affordable houses of 238 local affordable houses needed over the 20 years, so 2011 to 2031. That figure is now 194. So I think it's dropped, but not massively. And we use updated parish housing needs surveys for planning applications anyway, but it wasn't a piece of work that needed to be done, and it's been done. The key part of the process of local plan review, 5-year review, is to work with neighbouring authorities and statutory agencies such as Natural England through what's known as duty to cooperate. So it's a legal requirement, particularly around duty to cross-boundary issues, so issues across the national park boundary into districts and counties elsewhere. So most of the issues that were raised, and we had a meeting in September last year, as well as some correspondence, are issues that we're already aware of. We know that there are issues around phosphates in Somerset, which is having major effects on delivery of development in those areas affected. We're still awaiting the publication of a strategy for Somerset and more detailed maps so that we can be very clear what area of the national park is affected and its significance for us. But we expect that will only be a very small part of the national park. So again, that's something that we hope will be available soon. We've analysed our appeals performance, so that's appeals against either refusals for planning permission or conditions, appeals for on conditions. And our analysis showing there's no significant increase in the number of appeals that have been allowed, or the appeals related to specific policy areas. So at this interim stage, we think there's no indication from that aspect that the policies need to be reviewed in the local plan. And then lastly, I've alluded to the stakeholder workshop that a number of you were able to come to, and we were very pleased you were able to come to it. But I think the next part of the presentation is now to look at some of the key findings on specific topic areas. So I've alluded to the fact that there's a website with links to topic papers, and they're divided into 3 key themes. The first is environment, second economy, third housing and community, and there is then a summary paper, as I said before. So on the environment, the interim key findings to date is from all the work we've done is that there are sort of 3 main areas of change since the plan was adopted. The first is biodiversity net gain, the second is on climate change, and the third is on beauty and design. So on the first one, we've gone through the plan again just to check our policies against emerging changes on biodiversity net gain. And biodiversity net gain, for those that haven't come across it so far, is a new duty which has come in through the Environment Act that became legislation in November last year. And in short, it's a requirement that through the planning process, planning proposals should result in a 10% improvement in biodiversity on a site compared to before the development took place. So it's going to affect a large proportion of planning proposals. There are some exemptions, but they're quite limited. So, for example, householder applications would not be come in to it, but most others will. And the duty will come in 2 years after the Environment Act, so it'll be at the end of 2023. And it'll be a duty which therefore on local authorities through the planning process doesn't need the local plan to have policies mentioning it for it to be able to come in. But we've gone through our policies and we don't mention biodiversity net gain in the policies specifically because it wasn't terminology in use at the time the plan came in. But throughout the biodiversity policies, there are references to enhancement, which is effectively the same thing. And we think that therefore the policies are in line with the intentions of national policy and the Environment Act, but it's just a different way of expressing it. The revised NPPF and the new Environment Act do add greater weight and power to the policies that we already have. And there are going to be new practices and procedures for dealing with biodiversity net gain, which are still being worked out. So we're keeping a close eye on that. But we think that the policies themselves would enable other things to happen alongside the plan to improve biodiversity in the national park where needed. The key tool that is going to be used is something called a Biodiversity Metric that's been developed by Natural England, and it is being already used in some areas. So we think there is further work that can be done based on the current policies that we have, for example, new guidance, to help clarify what is required for Exmoor. And the other thing I think is just worth mentioning is though we have positive policies, that the level of development in Exmoor is lower than in many areas, and the key areas for biodiversity changes are likely to be others, such as land management, that lie outside of the planning system, because the planning system is really only part of a wider solution to issues and problems that exist. Moving on to climate change, the planning policies have a very positive approach to climate change, but that are appropriate to Exmoor's circumstances. There is a policy on measures to help reduce the impact of climate change, and then a series of policies on specific issues associated with it, such as flood risk, coastal change, and a positive approach to small-scale renewables like wind and solar. Again, the work we've done at this interim stage, we think there is further work needed for action on this important topic, but again, we think that could be achieved through guidance and further work, for example, on retrofitting of existing buildings. Design is something that's moved up the government's agenda, and as expected in a national park, we've got many local plan policies on design and creating beautiful places. A general policy on which requires good design, and then we've also got policies in the local plan on design and sustainable construction, heritage, landscape, extensions, as well as biodiversity and green infrastructure, which are also linked in. So on this slide, I think the last point really to make is that we think there is additional action and work needed, but this could be done through practical guidance and extra planning documents, supplementary planning documents providing guidance on biodiversity net gain, in particular retrofitting and design SBD, which the authority has already started work on. Moving on to the economy, we were keen to just check back to all the evidence that we have on whether development related to the economy is coming forward, and the analysis that we have done shows that it is. So we think the policies that we have in the local plan are enabling appropriate economic development. So since the adopted plan came into force in 2017, we, for example, permitted 75 agricultural and forestry buildings, 1,680 metres of agricultural and forestry tracks. There have been 10 live work and home working applications. So there is development coming forward. The key piece of evidence that we have analysed as part of this work has been that done by Rural Enterprise Exmoor that many of you would have been involved with yourselves. Both the initial research and the subsequent vision that's published last year. And the research has been really interesting. It showed up 1,300 businesses in the national park. It confirmed that we already knew that a large proportion of those are micro businesses, as very high self-employment and home working. But I think it did show up a lot more businesses than statistics had previously shown. It's been really helpful, and it's confirmed the very high self-employment that we have here. So there's 27% self-employment compared to the average in the UK of 11%. The key areas of the key employer was through tourism. 60% of employment is in tourism, and then followed by food and drink services were the largest, and then it's followed by agriculture and retail. Agriculture and retail make up 14% of total businesses and about 9% of employment. I think, these are things that we knew, but it's helpful to have that really, up-to-date information. A key area that has been flagged up through the Rural Enterprise Exmo work is, not surprisingly, digital connectivity. We've analysed the number of masts that have been permitted since 2017, which is 16. But obviously we're aware that and people are working together to try and improve connectivity across Exmoor. The other key theme that we have looked at relates, not surprisingly, to COVID and the impacts of COVID, which are still emerging. We're obviously all aware that there's been huge effects on the hospitality sector, on visitor accommodation, but also changes in lifestyle driven by the pandemic, like home working. I guess the question we ask really is, are changes needed to the local plan to address those sorts of still emerging issues? Housing and community, I mentioned, is the third theme that we have been analysing. The information that we have checked relates to updated information on house prices and the increased affordability gap. So house prices have increased again, and the affordability gap is now 12-1. So the market housing is unaffordable to people on average salaries and wages in the national park. I think we knew that, but it's useful to have that reminder that the actual situation is worse than it was. I did mention earlier that we are concerned about the level of affordable housing delivery. Not as many local homes as are needed, local need homes as are needed have been built. And we monitor affordable housing completions. So last year there were 20 affordable houses were permitted. But we are aware that more are needed. So we're concerned about the level and the speed of delivery for local people, which is, despite increased flexibility in this plan, lower than it was in the previous plan. I think the view we have as officers is that further work is needed to really better understand the reasons for that. We think that the likely factors lie outside, for the most part, of planning. For example, the availability of grants for housing associations, which were much lower after 2012 than they had been previously, when far more local need housing was being built. And those have now been reinstated in Somerset part of the park, as well as the North Devon part of the park. So we're hopeful that that may help the situation. But we still think further work is needed to really make sure we understand the reasons. The Rural Enterprise Exmoor Vision has identified that more housing is needed, including affordable housing, adaptable housing, and local non-affordable housing. I think we are keen to just explore those. The vision, to explore that further, the vision recognises that many of those things are already can be delivered through the local plan. And I think one of the things that we're noting is that there needs to be continued efforts with others, as we've been doing, to support delivery, for example, using working with the Rural Housing Enabler through the Rural Housing Network, and also producing some additional guidance to help with delivery. The Rural Enterprise X Small Vision notes, as I say, that there is a variety of housing for local people allowed through the plan. And it's worth just noting the plan does allow housing for local people, such as affordable housing clearly, but also rural worker housing, succession farm housing for those wanting to take on the management of a farm from the older generation, extended family housing to enable people to support each other, and accessible and adaptable housing as well. The other part of this analysis was around safeguarding of community facilities to ensure the plan policies enable change where needed, to support existing businesses and to provide flexibility to respond to changes so that community facilities such as local shops can remain viable. And I think through the survey, we're interested to know whether you think that changes are needed to support community facilities. The next part of this is just about what the key findings are, and then I'll go on to finalise with next steps. So the local planning policies, as I've said, don't have all the powers to deal with all the issues that we face on Exmoor, because obviously planning powers are limited to what they can do and what the planning system can deliver. But at this interim stage, officers think that the policy coverage is good and the approach is appropriate to our local circumstances and to the fact we're a national park. We are planning further work to address some changes, for example, in the National Planning Policy Framework, and I've talked about some specific parts, some specific guidance. And then we're also analysing and have already reported to members on the outcomes of the stakeholder workshop in December. And of course, some further work and analysis for the review is still needed, including, importantly, the survey and the results of the survey. So more specifically on that, the survey's on the website until the 28th of February. And we will then be considering the responses that we've received. We will be updating and finalising the interim topic papers and producing conclusions from them. And then the outcomes and recommendations of officers will be presented to the authority. So, as I was saying earlier, if changes are required, then we can review specific policies. Don't have to review the whole plan, but they must follow all the legal plan making procedures. So that involves going through the process of evidence gathering and then preparation of changed policies, consultation, publication of those, and then examination by the Planning Inspectorate on behalf of the Secretary of State. So that would be in a hearings or examination process, as happened in 2016. If the review concludes that changes are not needed to the local plan, then the authority must publish the reasons for the decision within 5 years of the adoption date. So as I've said, that would be July this year. And I hope that this brief summary has been helpful before your council considers whether to respond to the survey. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruth. I think it is appropriate at this point to take questions if anybody has got anything that they particularly want to raise. So if you could put up your electronic hand. Could I just, before we take questions, just check with you, Ruth, that the changes to guidance or the background advice that supports the policies can be done without going through a formal review process. So the view could be taken that actually policies don't need changing, but what does need some attention are some of the underlying assumptions and therefore the advice or the guidance that results from that. So it's not that the printed policy needs to change, but the way in which perhaps some of it is interpreted.
Yeah, I think so. I think the guidance point is a really important one. I think you can do quite a lot through guidance as long as the policy supports that. and it can be helpful for officers, for members, but also clearly for applicants and other members of the public as well. Particularly something like affordable housing or the biodiversity one I talked about. I think they could really help with the way in which the policies are being used.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. The first question is from John Anson. John?
Thank you, Stephen. I just wanted to ask what the parks policy was with regard to second houses, as this can lead to house price increases, which we've seen throughout the country, making it difficult for the local people to actually purchase a house, but it also cuts the income to the area as they're not occupied throughout the year.
Thanks, John. Ruth?
It's a really good question. That is definitely something that I think a lot of people are concerned about and have been for a long time. At the last census that we have the information for, 1 in 5 houses on Exmoor was either a second home, a holiday home, or empty. And there's clearly a difference between holiday lets, which are well used throughout the year, and empty houses, second homes. There can be a sort of difference there. But it's something that as you say, will have impacts on increases demand in the area and potentially puts up house prices, as you say, although it's difficult to distinguish that sometimes. And also, as you say, it results in empty homes, which can't be good for communities, particularly when they tip over a certain level. We would find it very difficult to have a local plan policy on that, because the second homes are part of the same use class as normal housing. So there isn't a clear policy planning change when somebody perhaps purchases a house that's been lived in as a second home. Now, that is being looked at in other parts of the UK. The Welsh Government has recently produced a proposal to create a separate use class. So a bit like if you wanted to change from a shop to a house in the national park, you would need planning permission for change of use, or a house to a shop equally. That change isn't there. You don't have that change in use class between a house and a second home, or a house that's lived in the second home. But the Welsh Government is considering introducing one, so we'll be watching that with interest. At the moment, as a planning officer, I think it's hard to see how a local planner could control that.
Rather interestingly, those of you with very long memories, or as old as I am, might remember Jack Ellaby, who was one of Ruth's predecessors. So when we were doing the plan before last, back in the late 90s, I suppose, Jack had a proposal that you should require planning permission to change from a permanent dwelling to a second home. And that was what we were floating on Exmoor then as a possibility. But we were very, very firmly told that it required a change in primary legislation. And there was absolutely no way, as Ruth says, that you can do that through a local plan. It needs a government change to be initiated at Westminster, not something that we can do locally. And I think that is exactly the case now. But we've got this Welsh example coming up with the devolved government. It'll be very interesting to see what they do and how easily they do or don't achieve it. Claire, I see your hand's up. Is this on this point?
It is, yes. Thank you, Stephen. It was a point I was going to raise later on, but as it's relevant now, I'll just mention it. So you may have noticed in the news that just last week, I think it was, Michael Gove made an announcement about council tax and second homes. Yes. And that, this sort of loophole whereby second homes claim their holiday lets and therefore benefit from council tax for business rates relief, that's going to be made much harder. So you have to prove that your holiday let is being let by at least 70 days a year, I think it is. So, where they change things completely, it may have to be a determinant.
Yeah. Okay, Claire, can I just warn you that your sound system's playing up a little bit, so for when you come to speak to us a bit later, you might just need to have checked that. Okay, Christine Lawrence is the next. Christine?
Good morning, sir. Good morning.
Morning.
Yeah, just a couple. Thank you ever so much, Ruth. Very, very good report. I just want to think for a minute or two about the needs of the community, not just affordable homes and not just about young people. It's more, in my mind, about the community and their needs. And we are an ageing community. It's great that we're all living longer. I feel this is my speech of the year, really. We're all living longer, but our needs change. And what we haven't got in Exmoor, and in fact we haven't got in a lot of areas, that variety of homes whereby people can stay in the same community but move to something that's more appropriate, smaller, cosier, better bathroom facilities and all that, which makes their life much more independent style. They can cope much better, but they can still stay where they want to stay and be close to the people that they've known for years. When older people move, it can be extremely challenging for them. So I'd like to think that in the fullness of time, are able not just to think about young people as much as we do, and I'm first to want to help young people get their own homes on Exmoor, but equally I think the change is as much to the older generation as it is now to the younger generation. And by having our older people remain in the community, they then become needs, and they need gardeners, they need people to do things for them, they need domiciliary care. That also provides jobs and small businesses for other people in the community as well. So I do think that much as we've in the past concentrated on affordable homes, which is absolutely right, I still think we now as a community need to look broader at the picture for the future, not just for now, but for the longer term future, because we're all living longer for longer, and therefore the needs will be ever increasing.
Thanks, Chris. Ruth, do you want to respond to that?
Well, yeah, thanks, Christine. Just briefly, I mean, I think we do recognise that importance of housing for people, particularly older people as well, in the plan, and because it is a really important point that you make. We've got a very high proportion of older people, and people are getting older, and so we did consider that, as you know, through the drafting of the local plan. And I suppose the thing I would point to is we do have policies on extended family dwellings, so that's new housing that can be created through conversions near to a house where there's a family relationship, so either for younger people or for older people, so they can provide mutual support, because obviously that's absolutely key in our communities. We have policies on accessible and adaptable housing, so where affordable housing is being delivered, either parts it can be accessible and adaptable, or housing that might be permitted to fund it can be, and if there's over a certain number, then proportion has to be. And that's really about lifetime homes that will be suitable for people as they age and their needs change. We have encouraging policies on subdivision. So if someone lives in a larger house and they felt it was appropriate for them, they could apply to create more than one house from that. Those smaller houses, which either could make that house smaller and more manageable, and mean they don't have to actually move, or even could potentially, for some people, enable a family member or someone close to them to move into the new unit they've created so that they can provide support. And I think the succession farm dwelling policy can be of help to farming community where they want to enable younger generation to take on the farm, so create a new house there, so that they can share the work for a period until they take over the management of the farm in the longer term. So I mean, hopefully there is stuff there, but I hear what you say, and it is important.
Thanks, Vivian.
Thank you, Chairman. This wasn't a substantive point at all. It was simply that when Claire Reid gave her answer, I'm afraid the sound quality certainly coming into me was that I couldn't understand it at all. I don't know about other members. I wonder if she could possibly repeat her answer.
Yes, as I recall, what Claire was basically saying is that Michael Gove has announced a change to the way in which second home owners can record their property for business rate or tax purposes, and it's basically tightening up on the process so that a loophole is closed, and therefore it makes it less easy for second home owners to potentially skip paying their dues. There is an argument that says, well, if you can afford a second home, you probably won't really mind paying a bit more anyway, but at least it means that a potential unfairness in the system at the moment is closed down. You end up by having to pay your proper amount of council tax or your business rates, not try and swap between the two, I think is essentially what Michael Gove has outlined.
Thank you.
But Claire will tell me if I'm wrong, as she always does. Right, are there any other questions for Ruth? If not, what I'd like Ruth to do, please, is just reiterate the point about parishes needing to have responded to the consultation by the end of February. Yes,
the deadline for responses is the 28th of February, so the end of the evening on the 28th, to have submitted responses by then. The reason that we need those responses by then is because we're working to a timetable. We have to have concluded this review by the latest in early July. So that's why we need to have time to properly take account of your responses, but we are looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Yeah, and so it really is important for parishes to engage with this, because parishes and towns, because it's no good complaining after the event that the National Park plan's rubbish and it doesn't address particular issues. Now's the chance to say, well, actually, here is a problem. Does this need changing actually in the plan? Is this something that there needs to be a formal review of? Or is it something where it can be adjusted by means of changing the guidance, changing the approach, the interpretation? But in either event, the park needs to know. So if you can make sure that you've considered this, please, by the end of February and got your responses in, it is very important that there's that engagement. That would be my plea of the morning. Right, with that, Ruth, thank you very much indeed. That was super. And we'll move on, if we may, to Tom, who's going to present an item on energy efficiency improvements to traditional buildings. So I suppose this is part of the retrofitting thing, is it? I suppose. Yes, Tom's nodding. Good. Well done. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, it is indeed. So this is obviously becoming more and more of an issue with rising energy costs, the Insulate Britain protests. And I can see from some of the screenshots I can see of your houses, you live in older properties, and you're probably experiencing the same raise in energy bills as I am, and many other people are. Although it's talked about a lot in the media, there's quite a lot of pitfalls which people aren't aware of and that aren't mentioned. And that's because older buildings perform in a different way to modern buildings, and that fitting some of these energy saving measures can actually cause some harm and unnecessary expense. A lot of what I'm going to talk about doesn't come under planning policy and so is outside of control of the National Park, but I think it's useful to make people aware of some of these issues as much as possible. So I'm going to share my screen now, hopefully. Obviously, I won't be able to see you when I'm doing this.
Yes, you can see that now, Tom.
Perfect, that's excellent. So yes, older buildings are different to modern buildings. When I was training, I was always told an older building is like a duffel coat and that it will get wet and then it will release that moisture again, and that a modern building is more like a plastic raincoat and that will shed for water. And some of these energy efficiency measures, such as insulation, can affect how older buildings perform and lead to dampen, mold and condensation. So there's some things to be aware of when you're considering making some changes. There is a huge amount of information available online. The best resource is the Historic England website, which is where I take all my guidance from. And that list I put on that slide is just a taste, really, of the information they provide. So it's all aspects of insulation, draft proofing, double and secondary glazing, building regulations, heat pumps. There's everything there. There's a massive amount of information, and it's all researched thoroughly by universities and is really very good quality and is regularly updated as well. So the National Park has a few policies that relate to this. That one highlighted in yellow was the key one, really. So that's CED-free Conserving Heritage Assets. And it basically says that any effort to adapt or mitigate effects of climate change will be permitted where it can be demonstrated that the safeguard of the heritage asset is ensured, and that any measures to mitigate these effects of climate change will not harm the special interest or appearance of the heritage asset. That's the main one to keep in mind, really. So when you're considering making a change to a building to improve its energy efficiency, there's a few things which it's important to look out for. And when I'm talking about heritage assets here, I'm not just talking about listed buildings. We have an awful lot of old buildings on Exmoor which will suffer loss even if they're not listed. So it's important to kind of understand the building, understand what's important about it, and understand how it performs and what you're trying to achieve from that. And this is something which I'll look at slightly further on in some following slides. So obviously it's in the news quite a lot at the moment, climate change and energy prices, and this is being pushed by government quite heavily now. And they are legally committed to cut to an 80% cut in 1990 CO2 levels by 2050 in the Climate Change Act. So that's a huge commitment. Most of the building stock in the country is quite old now. So the figures which I've found are saying that residential buildings around 20% are pre-1919, with a further 20% pre-war. So that's a huge number of buildings, and it's these buildings which are consuming a huge amount of energy and leading to a huge amount of CO2 emission. So every older building can accommodate some change to help improve energy efficiency, but some will be able to take more than others. And I think there's quite an underestimate from government about the task which is being faced and how much alteration is going to be required to some of these buildings to get them to meet these targets. It's worth bearing in mind that only 2% of buildings in England are listed. And a point I like to make about listed buildings, and particularly very old buildings, is that in one sense they are already incredibly energy efficient. They were constructed from local materials, so the trees would have been from the local forest, the cob or stone would have been from a quarry in the neighbouring field, and the fact that they've been around for 300, 400, 500, 600 years in some cases means they have a massive amount of embodied energy already, and that they've kind of earned the right to be a bit leaky in some respects. That obviously doesn't help people's energy bills, but in that respect, the building is very energy efficient when you compare that to a new building, which may have materials shipped from all over the world and have potentially quite a short lifespan. It's my understanding that a lot of new build developments going on will only have a design lifespan of 50 to 70 years, and clearly that's not a very energy efficient building if it's only got that lifespan. I expect you're all familiar with EPCs, and these are all things which we see when we move house. Basically, it's a rating system to show how energy efficient the building is. It's been changed in 2018, so any property which is let has to have a minimum of an E rating. But there are exemptions in EPCs, and the key exemptions are that listed buildings are exempt, but only when the requirement to make it meet the energy minimum target would unacceptably alter it. So if the only way you can get it above an E rating is to put plastic windows in, for example, then it would be exempt from that change, because that would cause a harm to the listed building. It's also worth bearing in mind that there's quite a lot of assumptions made when EPCs are produced. So they will assume that ground floors are suspended, solid walls are uniform, and that roofs are tiled or slated, and that there is no draft proofing. And a 2007 study found that energy use was actually 40% less in traditional buildings than the EPC estimated. So although your EPC may be poor, your building may actually be performing far better than it indicates. So if you're trying to get up a target, it's probably worth getting the building professionally audited to try and bump that target up so it is properly assessed and these assumptions are taken out taken out of account. Building regulations are something which the National Park doesn't have any jurisdiction over either, but it is something that does need to be met when you're making alterations to buildings. But again, there are exemptions. So the main area we're looking at here is LB1, which is the Conservation of Fuel and Power document. And it states quite clearly that certain classes of historic buildings are exempt from the need to comply with energy efficiency requirements where compliance would unacceptably alter the character and appearance of the building. And these are listed buildings, buildings in conservation areas, and scheduled ancient monuments. But it goes on to say that there are further classes of buildings where special considerations apply, and that includes, you'll see in the second bullet point, buildings which are of architectural historic interest within national parks. So that would cover a huge amount of buildings on Exmoor. It also includes buildings of traditional construction with permeable fabric that both absorbs and readily allows the evaporation of moisture. So that goes back to my duffel coat analogy at the start. The important point to take from this slide is the bottom one, and that is that building control officer or building control body needs to take into account the local authority's conservation officer, which is myself, and this is particularly important where listed building consent is required. Now an example of that is this building, where the owners carried out some work with listed building consent and planning permission, but they didn't inform building control, and building control came over and said they hadn't done their insulation properly. And he gave them the option of either undoing their work and installing the insulation, or taking up this historic floor, which you see in the photograph, and insulating under that, at which point they phoned me and said, we don't want to take this floor up, but he's saying we have to. So I was able to counter that argument. The other option he said was you put double glazing in all the windows, which was again something which was okay for some of windows, but not for all, and we will come to windows. So it's really important that the building is in good repair as a first step. As I say there's no point fitting solar to a leaky roof. There's no point having a hugely efficient boiler if you've got really drafty windows. So getting the building performing as it should is a really good first step. Unfortunately, a lot of buildings, traditional buildings, have had inadequate or poorly thought out repair carried out over the years. I live in a listed cob building and it has concrete render on it and it causes damp. These sort of treatments should ideally be removed if possible, but sometimes removing them can cause more harm than good. And I'm able to provide advice on that, and there are various contractors who are also able to provide advice on that. Where we're talking about repair on a listed building, where it's like-for-like repair, permission is not needed. So we'll move on to insulation, and a really easy first step is to insulate roofs. It's cheap, it's simple, you don't need permissions. You just need to make sure that you're careful where you put it and how you put it down. And if you're in an older building, it's advisable to not avoid plastic and foil, because that stops that breathability of the moisture in the building, and use breathable materials such as lamb's wool, recycled newspaper, so on. You'll often hear people talk about U values. A U value is basically a measure of how quickly energy will pass through a square metre of a material, where the air temperature differs either side by 1 degree. And you can, building regulation says that a U value of roof insulation should be 0.16. And that can easily be reached with a lath and plaster ceiling using sheep's wool or hemp fibre. This photograph is my old bathroom, and you'll see oh, Ruth, sorry, do you mind muting? I think you're on. This photo is my old bathroom, and you'll see there's a mould patch there, and this used to occur all along the eaves because the insulation wasn't fitted properly, and you'd get cold spots, so the water would condense there and you'd get mould. So it's important that it is fitted correctly. You can also fit insulation above rafter level, so you'll see this picture, they've taken the roof covering off and then they're putting insulation on, and the roof covering will go back on over the insulation. This is quite complicated and expensive. So it's complicated but doable. It would likely need planning permission and listed building consent. And But it is expensive, and you've got to look at your cost payback on stuff like this, because it is difficult and disturbing to a building. And then occasionally you will have historic finishes to the underside of roofs, such as plaster or closed boarding, and removal of these. Again, if it's listed, we'll need listed building consent, and it's best avoided. There's other things to consider, such as birds, bats, asbestos, access to services, and these sort of considerations. Insulating walls is tricky, where you have a solid wall construction, which most buildings in Exmoor will be, which are pre-war. External wall insulation, generally, it really isn't a good idea. It's how you detail it around window openings, door openings, the eaves. All these things are difficult. It can hide structural movement. It can hide all sorts of issues. It is possible to do it in a way where moisture can move through the wall, but it's very difficult, and it will generally need planning and listed building consent. Doing it internally is something we looked at actually at the office here at the National Park office, which is listed, but the cost of it is huge, because you have to take away all the skirting boards, all the architraves, move all the sockets forward. It's very difficult, and the cost effectiveness is very small, so it's really not something to recommend. Underfloor heating is generally a good solution, where you have a suspended floor, so floorboards. You can get issues though with air circulation. If you fill the void with insulation, there always needs to be an air movement through. People will often get draft through the gaps in the floorboards, and these can be sealed, but it's just advisable to ensure and check occasionally under the floor that you're not creating an issue of trapping moisture, because if you have an unventilated void which has moisture in it, this is where dry rot can occur. So there are things to keep in mind, but it can be a good solution. This picture kind of shows ways in which it can be done. So you can fit a board below the joist and pack the void with insulation, or you can put battens on underneath with a breathable membrane and pack that with insulation. This will likely require listed building consent and listed buildings, but it's something I can advise on. Now, solid floors is it's complicated and expensive. So this building was listed, and they were having issues with the floor moving and dampness in the floor. So they had a permission to take it up, and then they wanted to insulate under the floor, which was something I queried at the time, but having done some trial pits, we decided it might be okay. The issue with solid floors, especially in older buildings, is that you have archaeology under there, and they had to spend a lot of money on archaeological digs when they did this work. So this floor we're looking at is room R5 in this diagram, and this is a mid to late 17th century house, slightly earlier. And the way this building would have originally been formed is you would have had a central fireplace in the middle of the room in R5. And when they took up the floor finish, we found evidence of that. So there's this area of burning in the centre of the floor. There's a stone which you can just see below the measuring stick, which is the half stone, and there's some post stones around the fire pit showing where cooking tripod would have been. And all of this had to be recorded and measured, and it was very disturbing to the building and quite expensive. And in hindsight, I probably wouldn't have given listed building consent for this work, just because of the amount of loss of fabric. So it's something worth bearing in mind if you are going to do underfloor excavation, that these sort of things can occur. The other things to keep in mind when you're doing solid floor installation excavation is that older buildings often don't have very deep foundations, and so you need to be very, very careful about how deep you go. And it can also affect water movement in the floor. So again, it's something which can help, but the cost and the disruption may not be worth it ultimately. Windows are one of the main points really, which I want to talk about. So it's one of the easy wins really, draft proofing windows and doors and installing secondary or double glazing. Double glazing I'll come to. Draft proofing is one of the best measures you can do. If you're living in a building which has older timber windows, which are a bit rattly, there are all sorts of repair systems in place where you can carve out channels in the windows and install brushes to stop that rattling. You actually don't lose a huge amount of heat through the glass, and most of it is lost through the draft. About 3/4 of the heat is lost through drafts rather than the glass. So getting your windows in repair and draft proofed is a really good first step. And then the fitting of secondary glazing should follow that. There's no point really doing secondary glazing if you've got drafty windows. Secondary glazing will generally require listed building consent if it's listed building. Draft proofing, it kind of depends on the extent of the works required. So this photo is a photo of the office, and if you hear some banging going on in the background, it's because we are currently having secondary glazing fitted to our windows and draft proofing. So the system we're using is magnetically fixed plexiglass, it's called, which fits onto the opening section of the window. So the whole window opens, including the secondary glazing, and they are draft proofing windows at the same time. The benefit of this system is that you don't have to take off the secondary glazing if you want to open the window. If the window looks exactly like it did before, opens exactly like it did before, and isn't clunky. I live in a building which has secondary glazing fitted by the previous owner, and you have to take these big glass panels off every time you want to open the window, and it's a real pain. So this system is much better. This is another example of it, and the real benefit of this is you get to keep the historic window. So people often want to take out really nice characterful windows and replace them with new sealed units. You can have best of both worlds. You can have the nice old looking window, and you can have a modern window fitted in behind. This is a secondary glazing system which is actually double glazed. So in effect here you have a triple glazed window. You have double glazed secondary and then your original nice looking window. And this is really important because it keeps the character of the building, the street, the settlement. The settlements across Exmoor have a huge variety of window types. Porlock in particular is very characterful. Now, double glazing. Our planning policy strongly recommends that timber is used. And that is because it is shown in numerous studies that timber windows are far better for the environment, far more energy efficient through their production and through the energy savings they produce to a house than UPVC. UPVC is hugely energy heavy in its production, far more energy heavy than timber. And so the use of timber windows is really beneficial. If you're living in a non-listed building, then changing windows, provided that they are similar in appearance, wouldn't need permission. That's if it's a house. If you're in a flat or a shop or a commercial residence, then it is different. If you're in a listed building, you're going to need listed building consent. And I take the view that if the building is listed, but it has fairly modern windows in it, so 20th century windows, say, of poor quality 1970s windows, which are rotting, then you can put in a double glazed window if you want. But national policy says that double glazed windows in listed buildings has to be slim. And by slim, I mean the gap between the panes has to be quite small. And the issues that we're finding with these windows is that they don't last very long, basically because you have quite a thin sealant bead. And what you get is this fogging of windows, where you get some moisture in between the windows and they mist up and there's nothing you can do about it and it looks really ugly. So I always recommend that if you're in an older building, you should have single glazed windows with secondary glazing, and if necessary, double glaze that secondary glazing to give you a triple glazed window. I mentioned Porlock earlier, and this row is probably familiar to many of you. This is Redway as you come down Porlock Hill. It's a really nice row of arts and crafts houses, all with the same window design. We're just starting to see a couple of the buildings put in UPVC windows. Now, with great respect to the owner, they have replicated the glazing pattern of the traditional windows, which are shown in the picture on the left. The trouble is with UPVC is you end up with a change of proportion. So the frames are much thicker, the glazing bars are thicker, and it doesn't quite work. It doesn't quite look right. And if they'd kept their timber window and repaired it and put secondary glazing in, they'd be getting the same benefit as their double glazed plastic ones, but the row would maintain its visual integrity. Obviously, timber windows do rot. These timber windows are about 300 years old and are now at the end of their life, and this couple have recently had listed building consent to replace these windows. I went out where with the joiner, we looked at them and they decided that they were beyond repair. So repair is almost always possible, but occasionally it's not. And these poor people have towels on the bottom of their windows to stop the drafts. You'll often hear the argument that timber windows don't last very long. Timber windows were given a bit of a bad rep, really, by the post-war timber that came along, which is very rapidly grown and just doesn't last. These windows, as I say, are about 300 years old and have lasted fantastically. Compare that to these plastic windows, which were fitted to Lee Abbey without permission about 20 years ago. These plastic windows have now failed. All the seals have failed, the units have blown. It's incredibly cold in the building, it's very drafty, and they wish that they hadn't taken their timber windows out. And they are now, there's an application in right now for them to replace their UPVC windows with timber windows, which will have secondary or double glazing in some instances. So timber windows are in almost all situations better than plastic. Now, solar panels, we have various policies on solar panels. The main thing we look at is how visible are they really, and how much energy can they create? So is it worth it? We won't really look at how much energy they create, but it's something you should look at if you're considering it. So people often think that it's a complete no on listed buildings, but that's not the case. We have solar panels on Dunster Castle. Dunster Castle is Grade 1 listed. It's on top of a Scheduled Ancient Monument, which is inside a conservation area, which is inside the national park. So if they can have solar panels, then it opens it up really. But it isn't always going to be possible, unfortunately. And it's something we've been looking at with our offices because we're trying to reduce our energy demand. And basically, the office is a Grade 2 listed building, and the south-facing roof is the main elevation. And it is decided basically that it's going to cause too much harm to the visual character of the building by covering the roof in solar panels on this south-facing elevation. So we're looking at the more hidden northern slopes, those ones on that bottom right photograph, which probably would be acceptable. They're fairly well hidden, you can't really see them. But when we had the solar assessor come over, he basically said that is not going to be worth it from a cost point of view. You will get some payback, but it's going to take quite a long time, and the amount of energy they're going to produce is marginal. So at the moment, we aren't going to fit solar panels to the office just because it isn't worth it from a cost point of view. The other thing to consider is air source and ground source heat pumps. You'll probably know that government is pushing to stop fossil fuel boilers, so gas boilers and oil boilers will be phased out. Air source and ground source heat pumps do provide part of a solution, but again, it is complicated, and the planning permission will often be needed for these. And things to take into account are where they're going to be situated, the noise they produce, pipe runs, archaeology. There's all sorts of things to take into account. This is an example of a National Trust owned property where they fitted air source heat pumps, and they wanted to fit them on the wall by the door. But that door was going to be a fairly main entrance and exit, and you'll probably know that air source heat pumps are fairly ugly things. They're quite industrial looking, and so we got them moved slightly and some shielding around them basically to disguise them. So air source heat pumps are generally going to be acceptable, but you just need to really think through where you're going to place them. Finally, just a few other things to take into account. So replacing boilers is one of the most important changes you can make. If you're running a 30-40-year-old boiler, which is very inefficient, then putting a new energy efficient one in will make a huge difference. But new flues will generally require listed building consent and occasionally planning permission. New oil tanks may also need planning permission, and they will definitely need planning permission if they're near a listed building. Electric vehicles are becoming more of an issue as well, and we're seeing more and more applications for charging points. These will planning permission will be required in certain situations, depending where it is in relation to a road and in relation to listed buildings. LED lighting, generally no permissions are required for those, and that can make quite a dent in your energy bill as well. And finally, the other thing to consider really is where the materials are coming from when you're considering doing any of this work. So if you're thinking of buying solar panels and they're being flown in from China, then is that really very energy efficient? It's very difficult to get to the bottom of some of these questions, and it's something which there's no easy answers to really, and I don't think it's something which the government has really taken into account nationally or globally about these issues. It's all very well having this drive for electric cars and solar panels, but what is the harm caused by producing these goods and shipping them around the world? So I will stop sharing now. So yeah, basically the point I'm trying to make is there are lots of changes you can make to your buildings to make them more energy efficient, but take some advice. I can provide advice. There's various contractors who can provide advice. There's a huge amount of advice online before you take the plunge, really. So I'll be happy to pass back to you, Stephen, and answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Tom. That was very interesting indeed. I'm getting a bit of feedback from somebody. Not quite sure why. Okay, that's better. Are there any questions for Tom, please? Or was that so comprehensive you feel now fully informed on the subject? Tom's always, I know, very amenable to questions being put to him really at any stage. So if you've got any points that you want to go back about that subject or anything to do with historic buildings, Tom will, I know, be more than happy to deal with them. But I do have a hand, and it's from Richard Peake. Richard.
Tom, I think one of the things which will affect perhaps this part of the world more than some others when it comes to trying to change our systems and the removal of gas or oil-fired heating systems is not those systems so much as the combined systems where you're doing all your cooking on them as well. And the cost, even well, I mean, if you're buying one of those bits of kit nowadays, you're into several £1,000s to do it. But it's a question of how you, I mean, I'm not living inside the park, but I do live in a listed house, and how I would achieve the same heating arrangements that I've got now and cooking arrangements without an enormous expense, I'm not sure.
Good point.
Yeah, I'm the same. I live outside the park in a listed building. I have wood burner, I have an oil-fired row burn and an electric stove, and they're all expensive to run. The oil row burn is not efficient at all, but finding a replacement for it is going to be very expensive. And I really don't think government is taking into account in rural areas, particularly where there isn't any gas or people are off grid, the expense which is involved. We fitted an air source heat pump to White Rock Cottage recently, and it was a big expenditure. And whether it's going to pay itself off over its lifespan remains to be seen. I am of the view that the technology for air source heat pumps isn't quite there yet, but that there's such a drive at the moment that things will improve and cost will eventually come down.
But eventually might be quite a while. Okay, thank you. Our next questioner is Lucy.
You're muted, Lucy.
Lucy.
Yeah, new to this. Linked in really with the previous gentleman's comments about cost. I think lots of people will be quite willing and would like to think they could do their bit, but the cost of doing it, particularly if you perhaps aren't thinking of it as your lifetime home and planning to stay there for, 15, 20 years or whatever, if you think that realistically it's a 5 to 10 year thing, you're doing it for somebody else potentially, whether that makes your property then more desirable 5, 10 years down the line. None of us will know the answer to that. I did wonder whether there were any grants available. I do know somebody who's got a listed building, terrible windows, and they want to do the right thing, but the cost of it is so huge that they are in the realms of, towers along the bottom of the windows type of thing, because they just aren't in a position to afford to do what they would be allowed to do. And all that's happening is the building is then suffering as a result because it's not being maintained as well as it should be. So is there anything out there for people to access to help maintain these historic buildings, but not necessarily at their own personal cost all the way through?
Yeah, good point. Tom?
So I'm not, in the good old days, you used to have VAT exemption for works on listed buildings and all sorts of grants. Unfortunately, those days have gone. The National Park certainly doesn't have any grant money. It's something which I know various members of staff would like to be able to say we could do, but we can't. There are national grants for improving insulation. If you go on the .gov website, there is quite a lot of information on there about insulation, especially, and that does include the draft proofing of windows, I believe, as well.
Okay.
It's not historic building specific or listed building specific, but I think the penny might drop that these buildings are not going to be easy to insulate, and that people will need more help. So I'm hoping down the line that there will be more grant for this, but at the moment there's nothing specific for historic homeowners now. And one thing which you can do, and something I'm looking at doing, is you can do a like do-it-yourself kit for secondary glazing. So you measure your window and you buy sheets of perspex which are to the right size, and you buy the magnetic strips, and you do it yourself, and that reduces the cost quite a lot.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, there are ways and means of doing it slightly cheaper, but everything is expensive, and your point about doing it for other people is completely valid. But some stuff, so when I bought my current house, it was advertised as the secondary glazing being a good thing, and it is, because it does help. So I think it does add value having a building perform properly.
Okay.
Interestingly, there was some discussion in the press last week exactly on the point of off-grid rural homes being extremely expensive to bring up to the standards which the government now seems to be expecting, and that there will be a political controversy about this at some stage before too long. So I'm sure we'll be in the vanguard of saying we've got to keep our Rayburns, or what do you expect us to replace them with? If they're doing like mine does, the central heating and the cooking, it's going to be fantastically expensive to replace that system. Okay, Angela is our next questioner.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask about the difficulty of choosing heating in flats in a listed building. I can't see how air source heat pumps could perhaps fit aesthetically or from a noise point of view.
Tom?
Sorry, was that a question about flats?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
In historic buildings.
Yeah, so kind of each case has to be taken on its merit. Generally, there's usually somewhere an air source heat pump can go where it's going to be okay. How it powers flats, I'm not sure, because that will involve a longer pipe run, and the longer pipe run you have, the more heat loss you get from the system, so the less efficient it is. The air source heat pump supplier would be able to provide you with advice on that, and if you're inside the national park, then it's something I can come and look at with them. And if you're outside the national park, then their conservation officer should be able to advise with a site visit as well about where it might be able to go.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. Peter. You're muted, Peter.
Sorry, yeah, I'm muted. There we are. Tom, I just wanted to ask a question about solar thermal panels, and whether in this part of the world where the winters obviously are quite cold and not that sunny, is it an efficient way of heating water?
It's probably a technical question I don't fully know the answer to. As far as I know, yes. Obviously more so in the summer. The technology is improving all the time, and we were actually looking at doing a water source heat pump from the bar for the office, and obviously the bar is very cold, but the technology is good enough to be able to produce the heat from that low temperature. As far as I know, it should be doable. I know they're used elsewhere in the country. As long as it's in a fairly sunny, sheltered spot, then as far as I know, it should provide some, especially in the summer, but you'd have to speak to the installer about that one, really.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We don't have any more questions. Yes, we do. They've just gone up. Tony Howard.
Just responding to that last question from Peter, I also looked into this myself and asked a company in South Molton the same question. They suggested there's two types of solar panels. There's one called thermal and one called PV, I think it is. And what they're saying is that the solar panels, you should put in is ones that generate electricity, but then it hooks up to your hot water tank. It first of all looks to see if the hot water tank needs topping up to a certain heat. And when it does, it then switches back to electricity. Whether that helps Peter's question, I don't know.
So photovoltaic cells then presumably is what the PV is?
Yes.
Oh, good. Right. Okay, well, that's helpful. Thank you, Tony. Right. There aren't any more questions for Tom, so thank you very much, Tom. That was very interesting and illuminating. A subject I suspect it will be helpful for us to return to, but thank you for that update to this point. Now, our next speaker is Claire, who's going to be doing the general planning stuff. I hope that she's managed to sort her microphone issues out.
Should I give it a go, Stephen? Can you hear me?
Yes, that sounds fine, Claire, at the moment. Okay. So over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to leave my video off and hope that that helps the audio. So yes, apologies from Dean Kinsella, who's our head of planning, who's not able to be here this morning, but I'll just cover a few of the points that he was going to raise as sort of more general updates. The first point was around the Environment Act, which came into law last year, November 2021, which Ruth has already mentioned in her earlier presentation. But this is obviously something that's very significant and an important piece of new legislation. So I just wanted to draw your attention to it more generally. The overall provisions of the Act are for the Secretary of State to set measurable targets for the environment. So that would include things like nature, air and water quality, natural resources and waste. So those targets are going to be ones that will be obviously legally enforceable. They may have relevance for us in the national park. Air quality, for example, will look at things like particulates. So as we're just talking about renewable energy, the burning of wood, etc., as well as tyres and braking, those might be things which will be things for us to be aware of. Something much more directly relevant will be around the nature targets, the wildlife targets. So they have to set species abundance targets for the end of 2030. So quite ambitious timelines for some of these things. In terms of how to deliver those targets, the Secretary of State also has to prepare an environmental improvement plan, a long-term plan. So it's due to cover at least 15 years. The 25-year environment plan that was adopted a couple of years ago, that is actually going to be treated as the first of these environmental improvement plans. So we already have something in place, but it is something that the government will have to report annually on in terms of how it's being delivered. The other significant thing that's happened as a result of the Act is that an Office of Environmental Protection has been established. And that body is responsible for monitoring progress towards the environmental improvement plan and targets and the achievement of the other elements of the environmental law. So that Office of Environmental Protection will be doing that monitoring, seeing whether the natural environment is improving and if targets are being met or on progress to being met. They will also be considering the performance of public authorities in relation to the environment, and they will be able to investigate if they consider that public authorities are failing to comply with environmental law, and the public can also complain to the Office of Environmental Protection if they feel a public authority is not complying. So some quite significant changes that will be brought in as a result of that. A couple of other things to mention as a result of the Environment Act is that there are going to be some new strategies called local nature recovery strategies being produced. The Secretary of State will identify the area covered and the authority responsible for producing those. We are expecting that they will probably be on a county basis, and that we're not sure exactly how the national park will sort of fit within that. Obviously, we're split between Devon and Somerset, so it's something for us to look at in terms of whether we will have a local nature recovery strategy across the national park, which then feeds into the two counties, or quite how that is going to work in practice. The local nature recovery strategy will identify biodiversity priorities. It will produce a local habitat map and mapping opportunities for recovering or enhancing biodiversity within that area. And then importantly, identifying actions and measures relating to delivery of those priorities. Now, we already have a nature recovery vision on Exmoor, and in both Devon and Somerset, the local nature partnerships are looking at work on that habitat mapping and priorities. So work already underway with that, which we are working with partners on. So I think those are things to be aware of, and you know, we will obviously come back and provide further information as that develops. The final element from the Environment Act that I was going to mention was the biodiversity net gain requirements. Ruth has already covered that in her presentation, so I won't say very much about that, other than just to highlight that it, you know, it does become a legal requirement, and so is something we will be doing some further work on. So that was the Environment Act. The other thing that I wanted to just mention to you was a new, well, a fairly new to us requirement, which you may have come across in terms of some of the planning applications recently in your local areas, which is called SCALE. This stands for Simple Calculation of Atmospheric Impact Limits. I think probably having looked into this recently, I think most people would challenge the simple element of that, but basically what it is that it's a legal requirement relating to designated sites, so sites of special scientific interest and special areas of conservation. It comes out of the Habitats Directive for protection of those sites, and what it means is that there needs to be an assessment of impacts from development such as agriculture or combustion as well, but mostly we've come across it in relation to agriculture so far. So there's an assessment of the impacts, measuring the sort of atmospheric pollutants that could arise from that. So things like, well, particularly from farming, things like ammonia. It can include nitrogen and sulfur deposited on those habitats. And what's required is an initial sort of screening assessment if the limits, so limits are set for the habitats that they can accommodate of these chemicals, and if the screening assessment suggests that those limits will be exceeded, then a more detailed assessment is required. Now, this has come up recently, as I say, in a number of applications for things like new agricultural sheds. It has caused some delays with those applications as we've got to grips with what is required. We do now have a new ecologist who has started with the authority, Ali Coburn, who's going to be primarily working on sort of planning applications. So we are hoping that with her assistance, you know, we'll be able to get to grips with this a bit more quickly. But if you've heard about this or if it comes up, that was just to give you a indication of why that is and what's involved. And then just finally from me, Dean wanted you to be aware that there are changes in the planning development management team at the moment. Sadly, we are losing Kieran Reeves, who is going off to work at Somerset West and Taunton. We still have Yvonne Dale, who's on long-term sick. And so we have 3 new planning agency planners who you may be dealing with. Their names are Tim Firmage, Tom Jones and Kyle Wise. So just for your information, if you get some new people contacting you from the planning service, that's the situation within the team at the moment. And obviously we're hoping that having those additional people in place will help to ensure that any planning applications are dealt with smoothly. Thank you very much, Stephen. That was all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was a good tour around various issues. Are there any questions for Claire on those things, please? I know it's all fairly high level stuff, but still it will have an impact on us locally. I mean, the scale developments, for instance, have caused quite considerable delays in some agricultural shed applications for reasons beyond the National Parks control. And it's important, I think, that parishes understand some of the pressures that are being imposed on the park from those new national regulations. So anything that anybody would like to raise on them? Yes, there is a hand up from Lucy again. Lucy. Yeah, and you're muted, Lucy. Yeah.
Sorry, I had a dog barking.
Well done.
I just wanted to ask the wildlife nature sort of targets and all that sort of thing. Is that going to be commercial? Will it extend to any householder applications as well?
Good point. Thank you. Claire?
So the biodiversity net gain. So this is that what you mean, where the requirement is that you have to deliver 10% improvement in biodiversity?
Well, yeah, in general, I guess, are any of these sort of policies and things you've mentioned, will they be taken into account in applications from householders as well as commercial or larger scale applications?
So specifically relating to biodiversity net gain, no, householder applications are not included in that.
Okay.
More generally, obviously, this goes back to the discussion about the local plan. Any application would have to be in accordance with the policies in the local plan. Okay. So more generally, yes, but the biodiversity net gain is not applying to householder applications. We're still working through the details, well, the government is as well, with Natural England, the details of how this will work in practice because of the small scale nature of development on Exmoor. A lot of, I think, the ideas behind the biodiversity net gain procedures perhaps relate better to large scale development, and so there is some guidance being produced for smaller scale developments at the moment, and that might be much more relevant for Exmoor. But one of the things we want to look at is whether we need Exmoor specific guidelines, and that would be something that we'd work on over the next year or so, as Ruth indicated earlier.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I don't see any more hands up for Claire. So Claire, thank you. Hang on. Bernard. Morning, Bernard.
Right. Hi, thanks, Stephen. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine.
Claire, it was about quarries. I noticed there was some relation, or it seemed to imply that more quarrying could take place on Exmoor. Can you? I'm a bit vague, I'm afraid. Can you relate whether there'll be more opportunities to quarry local stone?
I'm not sure exactly what you might be referring to, Bernard. Obviously, we do have policies in the local plan which are enabling policies for small scale quarries for local building stone, because of the the recognition that the importance of sort of locally sourced materials for fitting in with the local vernacular and buildings, but I'm not sure of anything sort of more recently which suggests that there will be more of those, unless Ruth is aware of anything that she can come in on. I'm sorry, I don't know anything more on that one.
Okay,
Ruth?
yeah, it's just something I thought I'd read at the bottom of all the changes to the planning, but
okay,
I might have misread.
Bernard, let me just start, see if Ruth's still here and can maybe add anything to that.
Bernard, can I just ask, can you remember where you saw this? And that might help, but I'm not sure.
It's a bit, but you know, with this new, you sent us all the details through for this meeting, and I thought it was on the national planning policy now that there was going to be more quarrying allowed, or on that base. I can't explain myself very well. Sorry, Ruth.
Okay, it may be, Bernard, that the best thing that we can do is just go away and check what the current advice is and whether there are any changes. And if there is anything to say, we'll just let everybody know by email. Just do a follow-up to this meeting and say the answer to Bernard's question is. Okay?
Yeah, okay. I'll do that. Thanks, Stephen.
All right, thank you. And right, we don't have any more questions for Claire. Are there any other general points or questions that anybody would like to raise? We've obviously now just heard from Claire about some changes to the planning team. So sad to lose Kieran, and hope that Yvonne will be back at work before too long. But in the meantime, we do have others who are shouldering the burden. So there will be different people for you to deal with, but hopefully everything will carry on working efficiently. I don't see any more hands. Yes, one's just gone up, and it is from Bernard again, apparently. Bernard?
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to take over.
No,
Kieran, we're very sad to have lost Kieran. He was a great help for Linton and Lynmouth. Can you tell me when the surgeries, if they're going to go ahead, when they will start again? Is there any information on that?
Good point. Claire?
No announcements at the moment, Bernard, on that one. Obviously, we've been sort of following what's been happening with the COVID guidance, and because of the pressures within the team, been just trying to focus on getting the application through. But I will mention it to Dean and ask him to perhaps in the notes give you an update on anything further that there is to say about the surgeries.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Right, anything else at all, ladies and gentlemen, that you'd like to raise about planning? Well, we've got the opportunity here with the officers and us all here to hear it. Well, look, I don't see anybody. So if that is the case, I will draw the meeting to a close. Jeremy, you've just put your hand up. So with good grace, I will say, Jeremy, you've got in right at the last moment. What would you like to say? You're muted, Jeremy. Yep, there we go. The floor is yours.
Right. Well, as a last point,
yep.
I don't expect any answer to this, but I might as well float it before all of you, because all of you are important in these decisions. Mm-hmm. Of course, the whole planning process is a balance between conservation and development. I personally am involved in many aspects of conservation, yet there have been times when I found it very difficult to actually be able to realize some of the plans I have, because, and the mantra that was given to me was, the policy is the policy, which the inference of which is that it doesn't matter if the policy is nonsense, actually, by the time you get down to the minute, down to grassroots level. The decision will be taken entirely on what the policy is. I think this has to change within the planning regime. I think you have to listen to those of us who are trying to make a go of it commercially on Exmoor in very trying circumstances, and are trying to do it you know, in the best, most tasteful and most sensitive way imaginable. And I would urge you all to be mindful of that when listening to proposals from people such as me who live on the moor, love it, and want it to be better for everybody. And that's it.
Right. Well, Jeremy, that you've sort of made my last point for me. So thank you very much. Which is to say that in this country, we have a plan-led development control system, and getting the plan right can take a very long time. You who were involved with the preparation of this tome, here we go, the plan, know how many years it took, how many public meetings there were, how many various iterations it had to go through, the public inspection to which it was subjected. I mean, it's not like planning officers say, oh, right, well, this is the plan and we're just going to stick to that. Thank you all very much. It takes years to go through it and check it and make sure that it produces the best result possible. And as I say, it goes to public inspection. It's dealt with by the inspector before that plan is published. What we've got at the moment is the opportunity to review it and to say, actually, times have moved on, circumstances have changed. Actually, in practice, this bit of the plan didn't work as well as it might have done, etc. And so the review process that Ruth was talking about this morning is really very important, so that you, parishes and towns, have got the opportunity now to say, well, actually, there is something here in the plan which we believe is wholly wrong, wholly mistaken, and this does need to be formally reviewed. And if that is the case, you need to say it. And the opportunity you've got is up to the end of February, so that then that can be built into the consideration that the park's got to take. It might be that you will say, Jeremy will say, well, actually, it's not so much that the plan's wrong, but it's just the way that it's being applied. We just don't think it's being interpreted properly. And that is a slightly more straightforward thing for the park to say, yeah, okay, we hear what you say. We just need to change the guidance, and we can do that much more straightforwardly. But you need to say it. This is your opportunity to engage with the process and make sure that you've got those comments in. You've responded to the survey by the end of February, so just over a month, I suppose. Richard Peake, I see your hand has now gone up.
This is just a passing comment on Jeremy's comment that I was on the park committee at the time when the plan went through. I was not involved in setting it up, but I do recollect that the planning officers were getting a little exasperated by the planning committee trying to overturn the plan they just agreed to on certain bits of planning that came before us. And I think it is something that we have to be mindful of, that if, as you say, it is plan-led, the first thing some of us were trying to do for what we thought were very good reasons was to overturn what had just been agreed and had taken the last 5 years to sort out. So we do have to be aware that in looking at what alterations we want as to whether they will stand the test of time.
Indeed. Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for that. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to you all for attending this morning. I hope you found it useful. And I hope that we will be continuing this process every 3 or 4 months by having another session. So I will see you at the next one, if not before. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and everyone else.